I welcome you. We are very pleased to have the group, what is the network, what is working with Ralph on right-wing extremism here during these days in London, and we're taking advantage of the experts coming from 5 different countries to give little inputs about the situation in these respective countries, and then discuss that with you on the background of what is going on in Britain. That's all I wanted to say. So we have 2 hours. There will be inputs, and then there will be afterwards a reception with refreshments. We hope you can join us to this one as well. What is starting at 8 o'clock. And over to you for your introduction. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrich. Also on behalf of the working unit on combating right-wing extremism at the headquarters in Berlin, a warm welcome to all of you. Of course, today our solidarity and our thoughts are going to Manchester. We are with the victims, and we are sharing grief of those who have lost a loved one. However, today our subject is right-wing extremism, and that's for good reasons, I think. Liberal democracies are under pressure, and not only by Islamist terror, but also from right-wing extremism, from new forms of nationalism and right-wing populism. It is exactly as you have written in the provocation paper for this event. We are confronted with fundamental realignments in the political landscape across Europe and the US. We are currently here in London with a group of international experts and researchers who belong to a network that meets once a year and is in the meantime already the 14th workshop of this network, and some of its members will later give short presentations in order to stimulate our discussion. So I think it's a very good opportunity to meet you, to share some thoughts and analysis with you, and I would like to thank Demos and my colleagues at FES London for jointly hosting this event. So I'm now looking forward to the presentations and debates, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting evening. Thank you very much.
I'd firstly like to thank FES, obviously, for partnering with us on this event. We share a lot of common research interests, and always a pleasure to work with you on these sorts of projects. I'd also like to thank our excellent speakers, of course, who've joined us from around the world, and also my colleague Jamie Bartlett, who's taken time from his very busy book tour to join us today as well. So I think, you know, as we've acknowledged, it's obviously an unusual day today in Britain. Our thoughts and prayers go with all of those in Manchester. I think, you know, it's impossible for us to have this event without also acknowledging the events of last night. And I think, you know, they are a very poignant reminder of the insecurities that we are facing in all of our communities right across the world. Here in Britain, obviously, we've been at a severe level of security threat for years now. France is in an almost constant, permanent state of emergency, and I think this has really profound consequences on the way in which we feel about our leaders, our societies, and our fellow citizens. So I think it's also important to remember, though, that the events of last night are the sort of things that galvanize many of the groups that we will be discussing this evening. In the shadow of last night's horrific events, we're joining together today to discuss the changing nature of the threat of far-right extremism in particular. There is an urgency around this topic, as has previously been discussed. So this seminar is going to begin with a short presentation from Jamie about his new book radicals, and then there will be an opportunity for a short Q&A after that as well. We will then move into presentations from our esteemed speakers here on the panel discussing specific national developments in far-right extremism. We'll then have time for an open discussion about a range of issues. So to kick things off, I'll hand it over to my colleague Jamie. Many of you will be familiar with his work. He's been at Demos for many years. He's conducted for however many years, I think he's forgotten. He's conducted in that time a huge amount of research into populism, democratic backsliding, and also in particular researching radical and fringe groups right across Europe. He was also the founding director of our Center for the Analysis of Social Media, and he's the author of The Dark Net, and his new book, Radicals, out now, available online from Amazon, I'm sure all other good booksellers soon, which was a really unique and immersive writing experience, and it's just launched to great acclaim. So he's here to give us his insights into the shifting nature of what it means to be a radical in the current age and how that relates to far-right extremism.
Thanks Sophie, thanks very much for having me, and the fact that I'm at the kind of top of the list separately is nothing to do with my seniority, as you can tell from all the other amazing speakers, but rather that I have to leave before everybody else to go to another talk about this damn book that's just come out. So apologies in advance for that. So yes, I've been at Demos since 2008 writing on these subjects, which in think tank years is about 150, because everybody leaves after 2 years, but I still soldier on. And in those years, I've looked at the way that populist right-wing movements, in addition to other types of movements, have changed from being sometimes upstart street-based movements to brilliant internet users and innovators on Facebook long before anybody else, to becoming self-proclaimed defenders of Western secularist values, as they often call themselves, and indeed a serious political and electoral force. But the last sort of series of work that I did was for this new book, Radicals, where I spent around 18 months immersed in a series of different types of radical movements, futurists and environmentalists and anti-tech activists, but also Tommy Robinson, former English Defence League leader's attempts over the course of 12 months to create a Pegida UK, a respectable face of far-right anti-Islam movements in the UK. And something that I learned from that, and this is the first point I'd like to raise, is just how important it felt to me, having spent really a year with this group, going to all the demos and to the pubs and to the protests and all sorts of other things besides, is just how much this felt like a social movement rather than an ideological one. I can't tell you how important the role of enjoyment, drinking, friendship, funny memes have become in groups like the English Defence League or their equivalents. And it seems to me at least plausible that the radical right or the populist right have somehow managed to achieve that almost impossible to describe alchemy of turning from this scrappy little group into something approaching a counterculture. And I think if you begin to look at the group, in some of the groups, in that way, that they define themselves as an aggressive and exciting and thrilling counterculture, you begin to understand at least some of the appeal of those groups, particularly for young people. Now, I can't really say much. I'm not going to speak for very long because I'd like to have a small discussion about some of these ideas. But I can't leave without mentioning last night's attacks and the way in which those sorts of groups will have seen that attack and the way they will have seen and acted on the response to that attack from what they consider to be mainstream society. And it is so different to the way many of us in this room would understand it. That is to say that every time, for example, out of respect for the victims or a desire to help the police by not speculating on the perpetrator, we stay silent, or we say very little, for groups in the radical right, that is just another example of an utter cowardice on the part of mainstream political movements or leftist institutions to be honest about what's really happening here. And the notion and the way that radical right groups have been able to see in that and to frame the response to these sorts of events by the establishment as they see it as being examples of a failure of the establishment to be honest with people, to be truthful about what's really happening, has become so central to their understanding of themselves. Now, it's not just to say that radical right groups might try to take advantage of attacks like this to galvanise their own support base. It's far more than that. It is for them an absolute justification, an affirmation that everything they have been saying was right all along, and that the rest of us were too afraid to admit it. And another example of this, very powerfully demonstrated in last week's, I think it was BBC documentary about Rochdale, was child sex abuse cases. And it has proven an incredibly powerful galvanising force to them to show that they were right and we were wrong. And that's a slightly more important and subtle message than simply let us take an attack and use it to our own advantage. They genuinely believe, many of them, that this is proof that they were the only ones brave enough to speak the truth about what was happening. Now, the final point I'd like to make is, as I mentioned, the book that I've written was not just about populist right or radical right movements at all. It covered a very wide array of different groups. And that is because I don't actually believe that the radical right is the future of anti-establishment politics at all. Into the space that the populists have barged, collapsing trust in democracy, justice, various institutions, mainstream media, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those statistics, there has been plenty of room left for other types of anti-establishment politics as well, many of which are not populist right at all, some of which, like Beppe Grillo's Italian Five-Star Movement, barely fit on a political spectrum as we define it. And when I look at the future challenges facing modern liberal society, particularly technological change, notably artificial intelligence, automation, which is going to have a serious effect on jobs, plus climate change, plus significant movements of people, plus a fiscal crunch, all coming together as I see it in about 10 to 20 years, a sort of set of challenges. I do not see in any way how the policies of the populist right are going to provide any long-term solutions to that. The problem is that until that time comes, I fear there will be a continued spiral of frustration and broken promises that will get worse and worse. But at some point, those promises that aren't kept about jobs returning or about borders being secure, there's going to be, unfortunately, continued turbulence. But at some point, when those promises aren't met, there is going to be room for very different types of radical political ideas out there. I think we're already seeing the beginnings of that. A lot of that is going to be to do with the role of technology in society. And so in one sense, to me, what we're seeing at the moment, the turbulence of populist politics, is really just a bit of a skirmish. I think a much wider and longer restructuring of modern society. And I thought that was maybe a useful point to end on, because I think it sets out possibly the sort of scale of the problem that we're dealing with. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Jamie. Now we've got a little bit of time for Q&A with Jamie before he has to run off. So if anyone has any pressing questions that they'd like to ask of his research, he's been immersed with all sorts of radical groups across the political spectrum, and ones that cannot be defined. So full of a wealth of knowledge there. So if you could just keep questions brief and also state your name and organisation.
And comments, please, because you're such a knowledgeable group of people.
Yes, comments are very welcome as well, unusually welcome. So please, thank you.
Luke Waterfield, a member of the FES establishment working for the Mayor of London, running digital comms. So I'm often on the receiving end of a lot of this commentary, and you saying the experience of what we get online communication. One of the main questions that's asked in that first gap, which is being asked again today, is something must be done. These people, they don't want to face up to what must be done. Katie Hopkins does it all the time, she's doing it today again. I think I have a good idea of what they mean by that, but I'm probably just guessing. I'm interested in your experience of spending time with these groups. What is that something that must be done that the establishment won't face up to?
It's a great question because, I mean, in the book, they kept saying, the groups that I was following kept saying, politicians won't listen. And I'd always say, well, what would you tell them if they were listening to you? What do you actually want to happen? And there was often not really much in the way of an answer. Sometimes it was a vague sense that our, British values are being downtrodden, but without anything specific or without any particular examples of what a response would look like. Sometimes there were more specific things like mosques being shut down or Muslims being better integrated, although quite how that would happen when they're being shouted at is not ever really clear. So it's to me it's almost the reason it's so successful and popular is because there isn't really anything to be done. There is no answer, they don't have answers. Instead it's a generic feeling and frustration without a clear sort of policy objective, which in my view gives it much greater legs because there's no policy, no fix, no language that would ever be enough. And I know that doesn't really help your cause or give you any answers to it, but I think that's part of the appeal, that they never really specify what is it. You occasionally will get total bans on people coming in, but that's actually relatively rare in these groups. So I had exactly the same question as you did, and there was no answer really forthcoming.
Question was to your left.
Yeah, Julia Purcell, I'm from Watson Park. James, thanks for that. I look forward to reading your book. I think you've probably answered my question already, but I'm going to have a go. You talked a bit about particularly the reaction to last night's horrible incident in Manchester, and you said we stayed quiet about noted identity, we observed that quiet, respectful, dignified silence, and that provides the space for the other to fill it full of horrible invective. What could the pushback look like, and I'll make some assumptions here, but what's our version of the drinking and socialising and the men's and the enjoyment? What could or should we be doing in 140 characters?
Well, I have absolutely no idea, except that generally speaking, I think it's important to understand the effect that we sometimes have on how those groups see us by the way that we behave. And I generally think, and it may be slightly controversial to say, that we have adopted too much of a sneering attitude towards a lot of those groups. And we haven't really done enough to actually listen to them and in a way diffuse some of the anger and frustration. Because a lot of the people that are part of the movements, I can't speak for every country's experience here, just our opinion, my own, is that there often really are people in society that have been the losers of the last 20 years or so. I can't really explain to you what it is we could do online in response to those things, but I have a feeling that in this case, in the last 24 hours, I think there has been a slightly more aggressive pushback against some of the stuff that I've seen. And a good example is thinking about fake news and fake stories circulating about perpetrators and what happened and other gunmen and all the rest of it. I feel like social media actually matured somewhat in the last year. And there was far more of a, you might call it a counter speech or whatever, of people pushing back and arguing back against this. And the frustrating thing is that's necessary, that sometimes merely eggs them on further. So sometimes the right thing to do isn't necessarily the thing's going to be effective with those groups. But, I feel like I'm not going to give anybody any useful answers to any of these questions because I grapple with them myself and end up coming up short every time because to me it's a problem without any obvious answers.
And it's not just down to you, don't worry.
Good, thank you, thanks. God, yeah.
Hi, I'm Antonia from Moonshot. Just a question that hopefully you can answer. which is about discrepancy between London and the UK. Sometimes I feel that we live in a bit of a bubble in London, and I just wanted to know, based on your experience, whether you think that's true, if that's not true, or if there was any discrepancy up north, or anything that you saw in that sense.
Well, we all live in our own little bubbles, and I live in my own little bubble, and the thing that I guess how I can answer that is that I was frequently accused by groups that I was following, and I had good access with all of these groups, of being in a bubble, being an elitist, being an out-of-touch leftist, without those people ever knowing anything about me or what I did. And it's a very easy way to silence you and shut down discussion. And I fear we're actually getting towards the point at which we are afraid of speaking our mind, as because we might be accused of being elitist, and so there's a danger of overreaction in that sense. But those groups live entirely in their own bubble as well, and so you have a Rochdale bubble that's obsessed with Rochdale affairs. You have the Luton bubble where Tommy Robinson's from, which is all very localised as well. And so, one useful and valuable exercise that I suggest people do is spend 3 or 4 days, create some social media profiles, and spend 3 or 4 days following all the key influencers and sharers that are part of populist right-wing networks, read the things they share online, and start to feel what it feels like to read nothing except that for days on end, about rape gangs, about scared police, about terror suspects, about the criminal system being broken, coming from very, very well-established newspapers and outlets, not conspiracy theory sites, and do nothing but read them, and then feel the emotional effect that it has on you over that period. And it is so strong, it's so powerful, and so many of those groups are in it in the same way that I'm in my own one that I've created too. So I suppose I'm more interested in those social media echo chambers, and we talk about them theoretically now in a way that we didn't a year ago. Everyone's now talking about the echo chamber and the filter bubble and stuff that only information literacy experts knew about 2 years ago. But you have to be in it to understand what it's like, and it's a really valuable exercise for people working in this to actually put yourself in there, because it's an emotional rather than a logical thing.
Yes, afternoon, evening I suppose. Carl Wright, I'm with the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, and maybe just worth mentioning in passing that the Commonwealth Secretariat has just set up a new unit on counteracting violent extremism, which is of course primarily looking at some of the extremism in countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, Kenya and others, but I hope we'll also in time address popular right-wing extremism. But the point I wanted to make, Jamie, is really the point I think you were touching on a minute ago. I think we're virtually on the anniversary of the death of Joe Cox, and to my mind the murder, or the political assassination if you like, of Joe Cox MP was the most extreme acts of right-wing extremism in this country over decades. And I was a bit disturbed how particularly the mainstream media, and of course led by the inevitable Daily Mails of this world, but even the mainstream media poo-pooed it, that this was just a deranged lunatic, which of course all these people are, but he was also an extreme right-wing extremist. And I think what you were saying is that we don't take that kind of extremist threat seriously enough in this country, and certainly the reaction to the killing of Joe Cox I think was a very big one. But I think the idea was that it's just some deranged individual rather than somebody who had a very, very hard right extremist agenda.
Absolutely. I think we'll probably have to wrap it up there so Jamie can run off to his book tour.
Sorry to be late.
But thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure everyone has benefited greatly from your insights, and will, I'm sure, be rushing to Amazon. Where can the book be purchased from?
Oh, Amazon is the easiest place,
Amazon.
isn't it? So I didn't want to say that, but there you go.
Yeah,
It's cheaper than everywhere else as well.
We'll be sending out some links as well for Demos as well, so follow Demos and be on Jamie's groupie bandwagon as well. So thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Sophie.
So now I'd like to introduce our very esteemed speakers here. Some of them you may be familiar with, others maybe you haven't come across their work before because they're from all over the world, which is a wonderful thing to have. So on my far right, this is going to happen again, you can see, is Heidi Bayrick. She is leading the intelligence project at the Summer Poverty Law Center, an incredibly well-respected and esteemed organization working in the United States. Then we have Michael Wine. He is from the Community Security Trust here in the UK. Then we have Rafał Pankowski. Apologies, I'm probably butchering everybody's names, but trying my best. From the Never Again Association in Poland, and professor of political science. Here on my left, not necessarily politically. Center left, Professor Thomas Grumke, who is a professor of political science in Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. And then finally we have Bulshu Bunyadi, is that okay? From the Political Capital Institute in Hungary, a political analyst there. So brilliant panel of speakers. Each of them is going to give a brief presentation on what's going on the ground in each of their national contexts and just some broader observations on this topic, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions with the group afterwards. So I would ask all of our brilliant speakers to try and keep to time. So we will kick off with Heidi.
Thank you. I want to thank Demos, as well as FES for having me here. Also, our hearts go out from the United States for the victims in Manchester. It's horrific, terrible thing to actually share with you all. And since I'm sitting at your far right, I will start with our president, Trump, who has come from the far right into power and is a particular problem for us. The organization I work for, which is the Southern Poverty Law Center, has been around since the 1970s. We're located in Montgomery, Alabama, and the work that we do in my project is to battle hate groups and hate in the mainstream. And we are now, of course, in a situation in the United States where hate has gotten into the mainstream, so we have failed at our jobs, obviously. And we are trying to figure out what it is that we're going to do with this unprecedented situation. In what the United States has been going through for some time, in a way, if you were paying particular attention to the radical right, you would not have been so surprised with Trump's election. One of the things that the Southern Poverty Law Center does is track hate groups, which are sort of white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, extremists like that. And we have been documenting a rise in the number of those groups actually since 2000. So there has been a backlash to increasing diversity in the United States, what they call the browning of America, for quite some time now. And that's one aspect of that problem. The election of President Obama and the census telling us some time ago, around 2000, that whites would become a minority in the United States, and the economic crisis, obviously, in 2008, are the forces that led to very disgruntled people bringing Trump into office. It was a razor-thin win, but Trump did something that we had thought was impossible before in the United States. And that's this. It used to be the case that people running for political office, if you were to show that they were blatantly racist or had connection to white supremacist groups or made extremist statements, they usually didn't get elected. I mean, I often point to a Republican who ran for Senate in 2006 in Virginia named George Allen, who during the campaign was caught on tape saying a racist word. He said macaca at a campaign rally. And within about a week, his candidacy was doomed. He was a well-respected Republican, long history in politics, and he was out. There are other examples at the national level that you can point to like this. If you simply expose their extremist connections or their racist statements, their political futures were doomed, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. In fact, the Republican Party in 1998 passed a resolution banning its candidates from having any involvement with white supremacist organizations, essentially. And then Trump announced that he was going to run, and the first day made statements about Mexicans that would have killed any other candidacy. And then went on throughout the year to say things about Muslims and women and others, Jews, to retweet white supremacist propaganda, and to do a lot of things that we thought could not get you into office. In other words, your campaign would be wrecked. That was the end of that. In effect, we thought we had sort of a cordon sanitaire, right, in the United States around at least national politics. And now we know that that is not the case. We're looking at a situation in which we have people in the White House, like Steve Bannon, who openly flirted with white supremacists, intentionally did that. A campaign that had staffers who were on the Twitter feeds of white supremacists that put out material like that, whose policies, for example, this border wall that Trump talks about all the time and is trying to build, they came directly from the radical right. In fact, one of the first people to talk about a border wall was actually David Duke, the Klansman, a former Klansman that some of you may know of. And an unprecedented number of extremists in the White House, people like Sebastian Gorka, who has ties to an extremist organization in Hungary. We had Mike Flynn for 20-some days, who's probably now going to prison, but who was very involved in anti-Muslim organizations in the United States, essentially an Islamophobe. Our new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who is an Alabamian as well, couldn't get a judiciary seat back in the 1980s for making racist statements and jokes about the Klan, and has worked with hate groups just recently, anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic hate groups, and he now sits in a seat of power. On top of that, that's bad enough. The policies are terrible, like the Muslim ban, the border wall, and so on. These are all radical right ideas, very extreme ideas for the United States. But we have a totally energized white supremacist movement that's probably larger than it's ever been, and it has an online presence that's sort of doubling every year or so. People who are very, very engaged. And we've had a rash of hate crimes like we've never seen before since the election. I think in the first 10 days, we documented almost 900 of these incidents, which are numbers that are very, very high. And a president-elect during that period who didn't care about it at all, barely was willing to condemn what was the violence that was happening in about a fifth of those incidents directly in his name. There had also been hate crimes during the campaign done by Trump supporters. It's sort of an astounding situation to see that we could have white supremacy come roaring back in this way so quickly in the United States. It's obviously something the U.S. has been battling against since its founding until the mid-1960s. I'll just talk about a couple little parallels in our history that might explain this moment a little more. The last time that the United States engaged in rapidly anti-immigrant politics, which was the 1924 Anti-Immigrant Act, when everybody was banned from the United States except for quote-unquote Nordics. That was a time period when we had about the same percentage foreign-born population in the United States. Obviously, the number of people in the U.S. was much lower. And we had the second-generation Klan arise, so very, very large amount of white supremacy. So we're facing an incredible backlash that has expressed itself in this presidential election. And I think it's a very fundamental challenge to the narrative that the United States had going since the time of Martin Luther King, right? That we were, we were going to bend the arc of justice, right? That we're going to somehow get better. And apparently, you can take your foot off that arc and end up in a much worse place. So those are sort of the dynamics that are going on. There are several aspects to that, some of which were talked about just now, having to do with the web and exploding hate speech that I'm happy to talk about. And we are trying to figure out what are the most productive ways to now engage in this space and try to stop this backlash from occurring. I'll just stop there.
Heidi, absolutely fascinating and terrifying developments in the United States. Next we'll go on to Mike. I guess you're on the front line of the situation here in Britain, so particularly poignant for your work.
Let me preface my remarks by saying that whilst the Community Security Trust is the defence agency of the Jewish community here, I'm doing a lot of work in Europe for the European agencies on policy formulation against extremism. So I want to refer a little bit to that, although you're probably expecting me to talk primarily about the UK. I think it will be interesting to see what reaction there will be among far-right extremists over the course of the next few days in the wake of the Manchester attack, because you may recall that in the wake of the murder of Lee Rigby, and then around the time of the referendum, the Brexit vote, we had an enormous increase in racist incidents, primarily directed at Muslims, although in the case of the Brexit vote it was also directed against East Europeans, particularly Polish citizens living in the UK. And we didn't see that in the wake of the Westminster attack. Why is that? Has the far right gone, or have the police and government got their act together? And I think you can say possibly both of those things, because we've seen in the recent local elections how UKIP, for example, lost 145 of its seats and won just one, and its share of the vote plummeted from 22% down to 5% nationally. If we look forward a couple of weeks to the general election, the BNP are standing for candidates. The other far-right groups, National Front and so on, are also standing really just a tiny handful. So where has all that support gone? Has the far right in the UK disappeared? I would suggest probably it hasn't, but that those who've been leading have lost, for a variety of reasons, the capacity to harness that, but that there is still some of that anger out there, and which could be harnessed against visible minorities and others. But I think also policies and strategies have begun to work. The PREVENT strategy, it doesn't just focus on counterterrorism. Quite a large part of PREVENT is focused on the extreme right, and the counter-extremism strategy also has a substantial focus on the extreme right. In other words, there's been a realization by the British government and by law enforcement agencies in the last couple of years that the far right also poses a substantial threat. Remember that there are over 20 far right activists currently in prison for terrorism offences, and then a couple of those were sentenced for plots which were really sophisticated. In one case, a father and son had built a viable biochemical device. In another case, a guy had a stockpile of military explosives, the largest of which is outside the military, or was outside the military. So you're not talking about complete no-hopers amongst these far-right activists. You're talking about people who are capable of putting together a sophisticated plot, albeit there may only have been a couple of them operating, but also building sophisticated weapons. So, there's a recognition in these counter-terrorism, counter-extremism strategies that the far right poses perhaps not as big a threat as that from jihadi terrorism, but certainly a very substantial one. And you see that being reflected in the way that law enforcement agencies are operating. So there's a whole, I've listed, I'm not going to read them out, but in the last 2 years, 8 or 9 far-right activists have been imprisoned, either for terrorist plots or for incitement online and on the streets, and they've gone away for substantial periods of time, some of them. The prosecution service, the CPS, has issued a series of policy directives and training sessions for prosecutors, assisting them to focus on this threat. It's issued warnings. I remember there was a warning 2 years ago from Chief Crown Prosecutor saying, you behave online as you behave offline, otherwise the law will clamp down on you very hard. And so there has been a very substantial focus because it's recognized that that there is this threat and potential for the economic situation and disaffection from Europe and the EU and a host of migration, particularly migration, are all things which will lead to extremism and potentially to violent reactions. That situation is reflected even more so within Europe. I know we sometimes mock other European states, but if you look at the work that the European agencies have been engaged in the last couple of years, and I'm talking about from the European Parliament to the Council of the EU, to the Commission, to the Fundamental Rights Agency, to CEPOL, which has been revisited as the European Agency for Law Enforcement Training, which used to be hosted in the UK. We never really did much with it, but it's gone elsewhere now. They've been given a new mandate in the last 12 months or so. If you look at the money that is going into counter-extremism training, if you look at the resolutions within these parliamentary frameworks, PACE, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, the OSCE, which brings together Europe and North America. There's an incredible amount of energy focused on counter-extremism and on police training and enhancing the role of civil society in combating all of this. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a recognition both within Europe and in the UK that there is this potential for real violence on the streets as a reaction to all the problems that we've been going through in the last couple of years. I think that these policies, both domestically and in Europe, are beginning to pay dividends. I mean, time will tell, but certainly there was the recognition a couple of years ago that these threats were looming, and a willingness to deal with them properly by training policemen, prosecutors, judiciary, and enhancing the role of law enforcement and the role also of civil society in advising and providing context to the work of government and states agencies. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mike. Absolutely fascinating. Rafa.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, even though it is obviously a very sad day. I want to tell you a little bit about Poland, and, if time allows, a little bit about Britain in relation to Poland.
It's very important.
I have to start by saying there has been a breakdown in democratic culture, the way I see it, in the last few years in Poland. And that manifests itself in different ways, and I'm sure you heard there are issues around some policies on the level of the current government, issues around refugee policy, issues around gay rights, issues around the rule of law, media freedom, and so on. I'm not able to discuss them in detail, but the Polish foreign minister spelled it out by one sentence. He said in an interview with a German newspaper, when he said, "We are against the Marxist vision of Europe that consists of bicycles, vegetarianism, and the mixing of cultures and races." That was a very strange thing to say for a diplomat, but I think in a certain way it reflects a climate that we are experiencing in Poland today, the climate of hostility to diversity. And that, of course, goes against a very important part of Polish history, because if you look at the 1,000 years of Polish history in its totality, you will find Poland used to be the most diverse, the most multicultural nation in Europe. Until World War II, until the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, deportations. Well, today Poland is the least multicultural nation in Europe. It's the most homogeneous, mono-ethnic, monocultural country, unfortunately. Well, despite a very small number of minorities in Poland, we have witnessed a very large rise in the number of hate crimes that we have monitored and documented as Never Again Association over the last 2 years. But what I think is the most alarming aspect of the current Polish situation is what happens with the young generation in terms of the democratic culture and democratic values. And I think there is definitely a paradox here, because the widespread assumption on the part of what we might call the liberal elite, especially in the 90s, was that the young people who are raised and socialized in the new democratic reality would be automatically more open-minded, more tolerant than their parents and grandparents. Well, it didn't happen. What happened, unfortunately, is the other way around. It's the opposite. And it is unfortunately the younger people who tend to be less tolerant, less open-minded, less progressive than the parents or even the grandparents. Well, that's manifested in many ways. It's very visible in the Polish football culture, for example, but not just that. And there is a mountain of sociological data showing it. So let me just give you one or two examples. An opinion poll that was published in January this year found that the percentage of Polish people who are completely against admitting any refugees to Poland is 52%. Okay? That's despite the fact that very few refugees actually come to Poland. But the same question was asked when it was asked to people under 35. The approval was much higher, it was 62%. And I think that shows something important, and as I said, there are many more examples of that. There is a political party, a movement in the Polish parliament that is even more right-wing than the ruling party, and that is called the Cookies movement. Cookies is actually somebody's name. Paweł Cookies is the leader who used to be a rock star. And 2 years ago, he decided to become a politician, and today he's a leader of a far-right nationalist group in parliament. He said things such as, he dismissed the pro-democratic demonstrations that happened in Poland in the last year by saying they are sponsored by the Jewish bankers. This is the discourse we are talking about. Well, he got 10% in the last national election, and he has 10% of seats in the Polish parliament since the autumn of 2015. But his share of the vote among the youngest voters, under 30, was twice as high. It was 20%. As I promised, I want to mention something about Britain very quickly, because that has also repercussions vis-à-vis the Polish community here. If you look at the results of the Polish election at the Polish consulates in Britain, where Polish citizens who are British residents voted, at the last election, this far-right party I just mentioned, the Cookies Movement, it was the #1 choice among those people who voted here. They got 24% of the vote. The current ruling party, Law and Justice, which, as we know, is referred to usually as a right-wing populist party, it came second. It had 23% of the vote. The party that came third was the Corbyn party. I'm sure few of you heard of it, but many of you will have heard of the leader of the party, who recently said in the European Parliament that women are less intelligent and they should be paid less. I think some of you may have heard about that. And it's not even the most offensive thing that he said in his political life. Well, his party got 20% of the vote. And the fourth party was the mainstream center-right party, the Civic Platform, and it got less than 15%. So I'm talking about the political preferences of the Polish community in the UK. Not long ago, just a few weeks ago, working with CST, we managed to prevent a British visit by a particular fanatical, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Polish priest who was going to speak at the Britain First rally and also to meet with his supporters in the Polish community. That was interesting, but we also realized that visits like that happen all the time, almost every week. There is a lot of movement between Poland and Britain, and there are many events organized by the Polish far-right groups among the Polish, or for the Polish community in the UK, as I said, almost every week. And some of those events are attended by up to 1,000 people. So to wrap it up, now I would say it's probably time to wake up for British institutions and British civil society to this phenomenon of far-right radicalization in this country as well. And I want to mention that the Never Again Association is ready and eager to cooperate with British partners on this topic. And if you are interested in other activities of Never Again, I just want to encourage you to help yourself to some of our materials outside of the table. Thank you for your patience.
No, thank you. Absolutely disturbing statistics there. Unfortunately, we're seeing similar in many other countries in Europe as well. Thomas, would you like to take us to Germany?
Well, at least for 7 minutes, that's how much I got, right? So, well, usually professors are paid to talk a lot, so I will try to do my best to do it as short as possible. This is usually stuff for at least one semester, so it is really not easy. I would like to start, you know, to say, and also what Jamie said, that in my opinion, we have been discussing this not only in Germany, but also in this workshop a lot, that we are facing three crises in you know, what we call Western democratic society, industrialized society within globalization. And I think this is the platform, this is really what right-wing extremists, you know, also operate on, you know, and we have to really look, you know, go a step back and see what we're really dealing with. And it's one, the crisis of distribution, the crisis of representation, and the crisis of identity. And I mean, I agree with Jamie that right-wing extremists or populists have no solution for any of this, but nor do the democratic parties, and that's the trouble. So we should not always just say, oh, they don't have any solution. Well, we should have to ask ourselves, what are our solutions? So I'm just going to mention that, because I think that then we're going to get a step closer to the solution, maybe, if we think about that. Second thing, I think we are facing what in Germany we call an entleerte Demokratie, so an empty democracy. That means our institutions are working really nicely, you know, like clockwork, all the institutions, it doesn't matter. 50, 60, 70% of people vote or not, or like in the US, 10 sometimes. Institutions still work, you know. But this democracy is empty in practice. And I see this with my students. I mean, I have to mention the school I teach at is the State School for Public Administration, and I'm working solely in the Department of Police, so all my students are police, future police. So obviously all these topics, extremism, democracy, and what they are actually going to defend, by definition, you know, in their position, is very, very important. So these are the people, in my opinion, who have to be the first to answer the question, you know, what is actually democracy? You know, but in school, when they arrive at our place, they have at least 12 years of school behind them, nothing. So these are all problems we have to keep in mind if we talk about the others. Yeah, the others, the extremists, all of that. Because we have to fix our own problems first, in my opinion. Okay, so then I'm going to bring you some good news. In Germany, organized right-wing extremism is absolutely, totally on the fringe. Especially when it comes to party politics, they have absolutely no success whatsoever. The cordon sanitaire that we have, obviously also for historical reasons, is still more or less, but most of the time in place. If you make racist statements like Rafal just said in Germany, I mean, that's really the end of your political career. That's it. Jewish conspiracy, all these racist things, or you know, this is not happening in public life. This is going to be it. That's the good news. So, like here in Britain, we don't have any really right-wing extremist forces in parliament or so that we can talk of. But what we have is what I would call an uncivil society that is just really, you know, showing its ugly head more and more. And that's obviously also, you have to see, you know, the circumstances unlike Poland. I mean, my city where I live has more refugees than all of Poland, obviously. So the situation in Germany is a little bit different. I mean, we have a real situation with, I don't know, estimated 1.5 million refugees just recently, plus the Eastern Europeans, plus the Southern Europeans, plus everybody else. So we have massive, massive, massive immigrations. We now even have, I have a personal friend who's British. Now he took the German citizenship because he likes to stay, and dumped his British one. So we also have new citizens that way. So it's a lot going on in German society right now. And so, as you can imagine, we have parts of society who completely dislike this development. Some of them would then join some of the old-time extremist organizations, but most of them seem to look for a different avenue to you know, express their anger and say, well, this is not my Germany anymore. So one of the things that I would call part of uncivil society is obviously Pegida. This is mostly an East German thing. It's a strange kind of combination of really unhappy people who come mostly from rural areas who say, well, this is just not wrong. And then you confront them, and we always see the same pattern. This is a very emotionally, just what Jamie said, this is all very emotional. And then we come along with statistics. You know, we always argue rationally. And there's no wonder that this doesn't work. They argue in an emotional way, your Germanness, your culture, your identity, and then we say, yeah, but you know, in Saxony there's hardly any Muslims. What are you talking about? That's the statistic. It's true. Yeah? But then they say, I don't care. I don't want my city to look like Berlin. End of discussion. It's not rational. So it would be a big mistake to try to argue in a rational way with people who are not rational. And that's, I think, one of the biggest mistakes we have to do. So I just want to very briefly mention one of the forms this protest or really discontent or what you want to call it with this current situation and with these crises that I mentioned, especially the crisis of identity. What is it to be German in 2017? You know, this is something my students also like to talk about a lot. Unfortunately, we have some people whose answer is violence. Let's say all this discussion, all this Pegida demonstration, this is all a joke, this is not enough. So we had a group that you might have heard of, the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, 3 people who actually over 10 years murdered 10 people, robbed banks and all of this. So they wanted to stir up really antagonism in the society. You know, it's styled actually under the American idea of leaderless resistance. So you have no real organization, you just kill immigrants in order then to have the immigrants protest or to rise up against the others, and then you're going to have like a civil war. And all that. So we have this, and the most recent development is just a few weeks, 3 weeks now old, and it's still actually unfolding. Is a guy in the news? He's called Franco A. So his real name is Franco Albrecht. So he's actually in his 20s. He's a career soldier in the German army, and as it turned out, he was arrested at the Vienna airport just 3 weeks ago. So what did he do? He went to some event there, and for what reason ever, he got a loaded gun that he deposited at one of the restrooms in the Vienna airport. And when and a cleaning person found that, so when he picked it up again, when he was finished with his tour, they arrested him in Austria. And what turned out then, completely possible, we couldn't believe it. It turned out, first of all, that he was planning, together with at least one other person, or probably 2 other persons, a so-called false flag attack. So he registered as a Syrian refugee, speaks no word of Arabic, but he registered as a Syrian refugee, and the plan was that he's going to have this terrorist attack, so there are lists of people he wants to assassinate, all of these things, and then he has his fingerprints all over. And his fingerprints are registered under the name of this Syrian refugee. So he would say, okay, he's Syrian. That was the great plan. So this brings up all kinds of questions. First of all, is there a bigger network that is styled a lot around this NSU idea, of leaderless resistance, attacks, on foreigners or on politicians? What's going on in the German army? What the hell is going on in the German army? So there's a lot going on right now as far as, they have an inspection of each and every installation right now in Germany. And the third question is, what the hell is going on with our registration of asylum seekers? Because, also this is a big question. Who else registered who's probably not a refugee or who knows who he is? So, this is just in a nutshell. This has many more implications, but this shows us that we are facing really not only an uncivil society, but also that we are facing at the peak or the most extreme. We are facing individuals that really try to act out violently on this discontent that quite more and more people in society also have.
Thank you very much. You wrap us up for our presentations.
Thank you. So I'm gonna take you to Hungary for 5 to 7 minutes. I would like to
Thriving democracy.
Yeah. So I would like to kind of give you an overview of the situation in Hungary. With regard to the thriving democracy in Hungary, this time I wouldn't talk or won't talk actually about the kind of the liberal autocratic measures that have been taken by the government since 2010, although actually Hungary is going down on this road, but I think it's not our topic today. But I just wanted to mention, because I think it's pretty crucial. However, it's actually an interesting thing that Hungary is, so to say, in the same league as the United States, in the sense that we also have a party in the government which seems to be a populist, radical right party. And actually the definition or the description which Jamie gave us about these parties, about these forces, fits very well the Hungarian governing party, FES, which is applying an anti-establishment rhetoric, actually. Fuel sentiments against migrants, refugees. Viktor Orban tends to say that he is kind of the only politician, leading politician, mainstream politician in the European Union who dares to say what others don't dare to say, who speaks the truth, others don't dare to speak the truth. However, you also have to take into account that Fidesz and Viktor Orban personally is a very pragmatic politician and also a very cynical politician. He started out in the beginning of the 90s, actually in the late 80s, as a liberal, very liberal politician. Actually, in the case of Viktor Orban, you never know what he actually believes in, what he actually thinks. And of course, you can also have the opinion that it's only a kind of pragmatic turn which he made, especially in 2015, and we'll talk about this later. Besides the governing party, which can, as I said, which can be considered as a populist radical right party, we also have a far-right party represented in the parliament. It's actually the second biggest party which we have currently in Hungary. It's the far-right Jobbik party, which actually has been applying a repositioning, rebranding approach since late 2013, so for 3-4 years. And it's softening its rhetoric. It's trying to move more and more into the center of the political landscape, and actually tries to kind of get rid of its dirty, radical, extreme past. But this actually applies only to the kind of mainstream communications of the party, the core voter base, the core membership of the party, and also the local organizations, local politicians of the party, and the local policies which parties mayor, for instance, apply in municipalities. They are actually the same kind of radical extreme policies which the party praised before 2013. So it's still mainly anti-Roma policies, anti-Roma messages, but also, of course also anti-refugee messages. Probably the one thing which the party really departed from is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic messages don't really appear anymore from Jobbik, which also has something to do with one senior politician of Jobbik who in 2016 was banned by the party chairman to become a member of the party board. Then besides these two parties, we also have a pretty developed far-right scene, which is actually very well organized. We have a number of extremist organizations, far-right organizations in Hungary. Most of them are closely related to the far-right party Jobbik. There are personal overlappings between Jobbik and these organizations, but also financial links between the party and these organizations. However, there's an interesting tendency currently in Hungary due to the softening approach Jobbik has been applying since 2013. There are increasing divisions between Jobbik, or actually the leadership of the party, and the extremist electorate or extremist core of the party, and the extremist members of these organizations, actually between the leadership of the party and the extremist organizations, because these kind of old school extremists, they actually want their kind of radical extremist party back, so they don't, they are not very happy with this kind of softening approach of the party leadership. And actually there is a lot going on in the far-right scene in Hungary. They're reorganizing themselves, and there are a lot of thinking about forming a new party, forming some kind of political movement which can then challenge this, the kind of the new form of the party, the new Jobbik party. And then we have an increasing presence of extremist foreign individuals based in Hungary, come very often to Hungary. Hokmat Hate has been doing an excellent research on this topic. Individuals you might know, for instance, Nick Griffin comes very often to Hungary. Some say he's also based in Hungary. But James Dawson, for instance, he is based in Hungary. And his organization, Knights Templar International, has very good connections to Hungarian far-right organization, extremist groups. They appear, they have common events. He speaks at the events of these organizations. You might wonder why these individuals come to Hungary. Well, Prime Minister Viktor Orban himself told many times that Hungary offers a refuge for people from Western Europe who are fed up with the liberal Western political and social system, and who are fed up with immigration, and who are fed up with being destroyed by the immigration. And indeed, Hungary seems to be a kind of favorable or advantageous place for all these individuals, because the climate, the political climate, is very friendly towards such ideas. I know I don't have time anymore. Just one thing, there was a question already raised about how to fight these tendencies or these organizations, these ideologies. I think the point, what I would like to make with regard to Hungary is to fight, to counter these ideologies. I think it's very important that you have a kind of consensus within the political or in the political landscape within the parties. And this is actually what we are lacking in Hungary with the governing party, which spreads discriminatory and exclusionary narrative, anti-establishment messages and anti-immigration messages. So I think without a political will, without a consensus in the society among the political elite, of course you cannot fight any of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brilliant contributions and a huge wealth of information there. Obviously, just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on in each of these countries. There's obviously some broad common trends. There's also very specific manifestations in the national context. We're going to open it up to the floor for questions, comment, debate, discussion. As previously, please try and keep contributions shortish and state your name and affiliation. But yes, ready for a lively debate, either questions to the whole panel or to individual panelists, as preferred. Anyone like to kick us off? Not? Yes?
Hi. So Martin, I'm with the Swedish Civil Service. And I'd just like to make an observation, which probably is also a question, about what was mentioned about the rational versus emotional approach in the dialogue. And I think that what we have found is we've had our fair share both of successes with integration and therefore a drop in right-wing extremism, and the opposite, where we've seen a rise because of migration. That a very big difference often is when we're able to not only say this is not a problem, or this is not an erosion of our values, but to be able to depict a positive image of some kind of long-term endgame that benefits everyone, including the people who have the concern that tend to go to right-wing extremists. And I think that a big discursive battle that occurs at the very start is whether or not people get to depict the status quo as a problem in and of itself. And very often when we strive to engage with right-wing extremists, we feel that the respectful thing is to acknowledge that problem because we acknowledge their suffering. But I think that very often we forget the second part, which is acknowledging the problem, but not then trying to fight them and say, look, it's not a problem, there aren't that many, or look, it is not a massive problem because we will do well anyway, but actually to be able to say, maybe things aren't perfect, but we have a vision for how multiculturalism or how other things that we defend can actually translate to not only the absence of a harm, but a significantly better world where you are also included. And I think we might all have a job to do in creating that message.
So an interesting first question. Have we lost the battle on making a positive case for integration and for cultural diversity?
I mean, I can speak to a little bit in the United States context. You know, the U.S. has this history that I would say is, you know, somewhat false, that we're a melting pot and the Statue of Liberty and people come to the United States and we're a nation of immigrants and so on. It's a narrative I like, but it's one that doesn't reflect the reality of many, many nativist backlashes in the United States against immigration. The idea of having a vision or a positive vision is one that the left has tried to enact in the battle over immigration in the United States over the last 10 years, in the sense that they've spent a lot of time portraying immigrants in a positive light, you know, concerted media campaigns and efforts along those lines. The facts stand on the side of immigration as being, for example, an economic positive for the United States. Let's not dispute the facts are good, at least when you're speaking economically. I think the difficult part of this discussion is when you're talking to anti-immigrant folks in the United States, they have a vision of society that's rooted in a fake past. So they are thinking about the United States as they imagine it from the 1950s. So this idea that you had sort of a future, right, a positive future that's multicultural and whatnot, doesn't really work when you're arguing against someone who literally is envisioning a past that didn't exist, which is sort of a, you know, white families and beautiful neighborhoods and kids playing in the yards, and these terrible brown people come in and destroy it. So there's certainly a narrative battle going on, and that's basically what it consists of, sort of a globalized, you know, wealthy, cosmopolitan society versus a fake world that they'd like to go back to, right? They're obviously not very happy in the one that they're in. So I'm not sure we've logicked out how to deal with those cultural anxieties or to convince folks that have that vision that there's something else. Now, of course, the U.S. is extremely divided. You go to places like New York, the coast and whatnot, they've already seen this future and accepted this future. The battleground is playing out in more rural areas, more white areas in the center of the country, the South. But it's an interesting point that you make, and one that has been thought of but not really tackled.
Angela Merkel's obviously sort of held up as an example of a politician who's shown moral leadership on the issue of immigration, whether or not. Do you think that is an accurate assessment? How inclusive was her vision for immigration? Do you think she's really brought everyone on board on that, or do you think that her continued support is actually reflective of probably a combination of other factors?
Wow,
Difficult question. Because, first of all, for most Germans, I think this is always an assessment that we only hear when we go abroad. You know?
Yeah.
Also, usually when I go abroad, I come back home, I feel very powerful. Because everyone says, oh, Germany dominates the European Union, everything you do dominates everything. We don't feel that way, I mean, honestly. So I always feel fantastic when I come back home and say, wow, you know, I'm so powerful. It's amazing. But regarding our chancellor, I think what attracts people to her is more that she's a real person. I mean, there are no scandals, there's no twittering, there's no nonsense, there's none of this crap. Sorry, excuse my language. But the older I get, the less patience I have for all this nonsense that's going around. It's called politics. You know, when you study political science, I think none of this in the political science sense of the word is actually politics. It's all just something else that I don't know what actually it is, but it's not political action. It's not being political, in my opinion. So she is still of very old school. You know, she does her own cooking. There are all these stories that she goes in the supermarket herself, gets her stuff. I mean, there's people like that. She's not corrupt. I mean, I really totally believe she's not. That's amazing nowadays. Yeah, she's not grandstanding, or she doesn't have a narcissistic disorder like others have, and all these things. Well, it's like that. So that attracts people because she's a real person. I think her policies, I mean, in the German discussion, she's really not seen as like this, this dynamic politician that leads everybody to a more democratic future. This is really, but everybody is so happy that we have somebody who's a real person and who's really trying whatever her best, I guess, you know, agree with her or not on the policy. But that's already a lot nowadays. Yeah? And that she's now this beacon of, that's amazing to us. It's nice to hear, but I mean, it's bad. I think it's because everybody else, I mean, we heard some of the stories, is so terrible. So we are the one-eyed among the blind.
The migration crisis, Rafa, has obviously been something that's been hugely galvanizing for the far right in many European countries, and even obviously played a decisive role in the Brexit referendum in that now infamous poster from the Leave campaign. How has that played out in Poland, which that's obviously strengthened the hand of the leadership as well?
Well, I think Poland is interesting in this context because it shows how easy it is to influence the public agenda in a way that has no relationship to any reality. As you may know, the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, that doesn't really affect Poland in any meaningful way, in any real way. We are only talking about a very, very tiny number of refugees who arrive in Poland. Probably not even in the hundreds. So when we talk about the refugees from the Middle East, that's a very, very small number. But despite this, it actually became one of the main topics of the electoral campaign in 2015 that brought the right to power and mainstreamed the far right. And the groups that I mentioned, they competed between each other on who is more against those refugees who don't even exist. And since then, it has been on the agenda, despite the fact that those refugees haven't materialized. So it's a threat that doesn't exist in any meaningful way, but it's talked about a lot, and obviously it is in the media a lot, it is on television a lot, and people talk about it a lot, and it's a non-existing topic for me. And just to supplement it with another little detail, the Polish Prime Minister spoke in the European Parliament when they had a debate on human rights in Poland last year. She actually claimed this criticism of Poland for not admitting refugees is unfair because we actually admitted 1 million refugees from Ukraine. Well, some journalists actually looked it up and checked the official number of people from Ukraine who received the refugee status in that period she was talking about. The actual number was six people. So there's a big difference between number 6 and 1 million. And I think it really shows that there's a big distance between the political discourse and facts.
I'm Liz Ellis, I'm Policy Advisor at British Lottery Fund, and I'd just like to move the discussion a little bit around civil society. I'm just thinking of Heidi in terms of Alabama. I'm thinking for international colleagues in UK this year we had the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Act, where finally gay men could have consensual sex in this country. That was achieved not by the state, not by legislation, it was achieved by incredibly brave activists, both gay and heterosexual. So I choose to think all the time about human rights and equality as being contested, in flux. What do you all suggest in terms of what we all can be doing from that context?
Civil society, who wants to jump in first?
The role of civil society is increasingly recognised by governments and by the European institutions, so much so that there is a plea for more civil society advice, because governments have not been doing terribly well in providing data, which is required to do, on hate crime, whether it's racially or religiously motivated, sexually motivated, particularly LGBT communities. And so European policymakers use the lack of data as an excuse for, or have tended to use lack of data as an excuse for not defining strategies and policies, but at the same time calling for more civil society involvement, because they can fill that gap and because they can provide context. And that's really important. So if you look at both European and national legislation, there is increasing focus on victims' rights. And in 2012 Victims Directive, which you see reflected in UK legislation, which puts the victim at the heart of the criminal justice process, puts an enormous onus now on civil society. And it has an opportunity to respond and influence legislation and the application of legislation in a way that it's not previously had. So it's an opportunity for civil society to make its voice, its influence felt.
Heidi, thinking about what's going on in the States, I mean, you're, I suppose, fortunate in a way that you still have a very strong opposition party, although its pathways to influence are somewhat limited. You do have a media doing some of its best ever work.
That's true.
But what role can, to what extent can the opposition against some of these kind of really nasty developments we're seeing be citizen-led, be grassroots up?
Well, I mean, look, most of the major political change for the better for civil rights in the United States has been driven by citizens groups. It's not come from the top down, it's come from the bottom up. So if we, talk about the civil rights era and, the battle for the vote for African Americans, that was, a movement that was started by largely African Americans on their own, right? And I think, we've actually seen a massive resistance movement rise up in the wake of Trump. This is true of gay rights as well, right? That was a movement within the gay community, starting with Stonewall, that got us all the way to gay marriage, right? These aren't top-down decisions, these are bottom-up movements. They usually start, amazingly, with zero support, right? So when black folks were protesting in the face of extreme violence from the state back in the 50s and 60s, they had almost no support in the wider society. So as bad as Trump is, there's a majority of Americans of adult age who don't agree with his policies, right? The dynamic is not as dark as the days of fire hoses in Alabama. And you know, the United States is different than a lot of European countries in the sense that we have a really vibrant advocacy movement. We have powerful institutions that represent different segments. This is true on the right and left, actually. So there's a lot that can be done from the ground up. It's, you know, we don't, you know, if you support progressive policies, you don't have the House, you don't have the Senate, you don't have the presidency, you don't have 35 state houses. But you have millions and millions of people who can turn that around relatively quickly. So in some ways, what Thomas was saying about a lack of a vision about democracy, this battle is giving that back. I mean, I would expect to see turnout climb. We're seeing activism in the streets like we haven't seen forever, an outpouring of financial support for lots of organizations who care about civil rights. I mean, that's the dynamic that's happening. You could take a hopeful vision about that for the future, right? And I do think the US is very different in that sense. It has a really long history of bottom-up fights for rights. And I don't see that stopping.
John Madeley, still connected with LSE. I wanted to raise a number of contributions which have made either more or less direct or indirect references to anti-Semitism. Like mine particularly made a direct reference to it. Anti-Semitism is almost the taproot of the extreme right in Europe for centuries. And of course in the 20th century tragically. And all of the countries we've been talking about have very peculiar connections and continuing connections with it. Nowhere, it seems to me, is it absent. Interesting to hear that Jobbik has dropped its anti-Semitic claims and appeals. It's one wonders quite okay. Poland has still is marked by aspects of it, certainly. I mean, the weird thing is, of course, that in the United States there are philo-Semitic movements of the Christian fundamentalists that complicate it even more. So this one sort of connecting theme, and of course anti-Semitism was also rife in the United States at various times. Of course, the most virulent anti-Semitism currently is in the jihadi Islamist world, it seems to me. I don't know what this means in terms of how it's deflected or inflected, used, or dies out. But it's striking when one looks across the cases you've talked about, how various it is now, whereas previously it was a collecting theme virtually.
It's true, isn't it? Because actually, though as well, I mean, all of the far-right extremism thrives on enemies. It needs enemies. There are always groups to be marginalized or that are perceived as a threat. Like maybe also to talk a little bit about what's going on in the hard left as well, because certainly in British politics, that's where we've been seeing a lot of the resurgent anti-Semitism.
Well, anti-Semitism has been called the longest hatred, and it seems to me that it probably is, and that it comes from different directions. And it arises for different reasons. So, for centuries, it rested on the charge of deicide, at least in the Western world. And then it became racial, particularly in the 20s and 30s, although it started earlier. And then it became political. So not only does it assume a different form, but it comes from different directions. We've not seen the diminution of anti-Semitism within the far right at all. But what we have seen is its replacement with other hatreds, particularly against Muslims. But as you say, the most virulent form of anti-Semitism now is coming from the Islamist world. And if you look at the ideologies that underpin current Islamism, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, or if you look at the writings of Maududi, who founded Jamaat Islami, and the way in which post-Second World War ideologues of Islamism used the anti-Semitism that was central to their ideologies, like Sayyid Qutb and people who followed him. Anti-Semitism is central to Islamist thinking. They believe in the idea that the Jews are out to conquer the world on the one hand, and on the other, that the day of revelation will not come until the Jew is got rid of. And there are, of course, the Hadith, well-known Hadith, and the commentaries on the Quran that refer to that. So, the far right hasn't dropped it, but it's found other enemies, but it's still there. Islamism uses it, and my colleagues and I, or my colleagues more than I, look at everything that is published by Al-Qaeda, and look at everything that's published by Daesh, and we look at it in Arabic as well as in English, and we see, even in the last couple of weeks, that the Jew is central amongst their targets. Sure, they want to attack the states, they want to attack people who have forces in Middle East countries, but the Jew is still central. If you look at the way that has played out in terrorism, the shooting by Somali forces of Al-Qaeda's head in Africa, in whose laptop was found operational plans to attack Jews in London a few years ago. And he was saying, you know, these are the restaurants and the cafes where they gather in Golders Green and in Stamford Hill. This is where we will attack. And if you look at the way in which Hezbollah, because it's not just confined to Sunni Islam, it's equally present in Shia Islam, you see the same sort of thing. The Hezbollah would-be terrorist who was put on trial in Cyprus a couple of years ago said, yes, Hezbollah is spying on the Jews in Europe, and this was my job. We were looking at where the Jews were meeting in Europe with the intention of attacking them. So it's migrated. You also see it in the far left. And increasingly, we are concerned by anti-Semitism coming from the far left. I'm not talking about criticism of Israel. Everybody criticizes Israel. There's a lot to criticize in Israel. But if you hold Israel to a different standard, if you don't believe that Israel has a right to exist as a state or as the homeland of the Jewish people, then you are in effect promoting anti-Semitism. And we've seen the pushback from anti-Zionists, for example, against the idea that there should be a definition of anti-Semitism, which was not, didn't come from the Jewish organizations, it came from the European Union Monitoring Centre, the monitoring agency of the European Union. They said, we asked policemen to monitor anti-Semitism. They said, well, we understand what anti-Semitism was 1939 to 45, but what is it now? And so it was they who wanted the definition in order to provide some sort of parameters within which law enforcement can operate.
Thank you, Mike. So you wanted to come in quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. Of course, I totally agree with what Mike said, but when we talk about all the forces and especially parties who are interested in electoral success, which obviously all of these are not, then what we call the winning formula does not include anti-Semitism at all. I mean, even Marine Le Pen threw out her own father because of that issue out of the party because he couldn't stop being an anti-Semite that he is. And we have other, Gerd Wilders in Holland, he cannot speak enough how much he likes Israel. And the AfD, which I omitted earlier, but obviously it's the radical right / populist party in Germany now. I mean, anti-Semitism is not at all really a topic there. What they are very concerned with is Muslims, 24/7.
Well, you just want to quickly, and then we'll move on to other.
Very quickly, I thought you were right to mention Poland, because Poland is a good country to study anti-Semitism. Not everybody is anti-Semitic, but I think it shows there is no correlation whatsoever between the size of the minority community and the level of hostility. And of course, today the Jewish community in Poland is very, very small. historically it was significant. So there is not a big number of attacks against individual Jews, not least because there are not many of them living in Poland, but most of the incidents are directed against memory or against symbolic targets or monuments or cemeteries. And that still happens a lot. I thought it would be good to mention one particular incident that happened in Wrocław not long ago. That was maybe emblematic of something. There was an anti-refugee, anti-Muslim demonstration organized by the National Radical camp, fascist group. I stress an anti-Muslim demonstration. At the peak of the demonstration, what happened was that an effigy of a Hasidic Jew was burned. You might ask, why do you want to burn an effigy of a Jew at an anti-Muslim demonstration? But it made perfect sense for the far right, because the Jew is the symbol of otherness. And I thought that was worth mentioning here.
Yeah, thank you very quickly. There was a recent research on anti-Semitism in Hungary, and according to this research, 30% of the Hungarian population can be regarded as anti-Semitic or have kind of negative prejudices or feelings against Jews. And although the Jobbik Party, in its kind of official communications or mainstream communications, dropped this topic, there are a lot of other extremist organizations, neo-Nazi organizations, white supremacist organizations, also individuals, also within the party, who are very strongly anti-Semite. Important with regard to Hungary, but I think it also applies to other countries, anti-Semitism has become kind of symbolic issue, and it's very much, in Hungary at least, it's very much connected to conspiracy theories. So Jews have become a kind of symbolic term and equivalent of everything which these hate groups are fighting against. For instance, liberalism or liberals, left-wingers, whatever. So they want to kind of label you somehow, then you become a Jew, without regard, of course, of are you Jewish or not Jewish. And then the last point, there is currently a campaign going on against George Soros in Hungary, organized by the perpetrated by the Hungarian government. And this narrative regarding George Soros as kind of the main force of conspiracy, Jewish conspiracy, and so on and so forth, has a long tradition of far-right thinking. And although I don't really think that the Hungarian government has this intention, this anti-Semitic intention behind his campaign against George Soros, but I think it does ring the bells among the people in Hungary.
Thank you very much. This gentleman here was next. I'll just ask both those asking questions and on the panel to try and keep responses relatively short so we can pack as many in as possible.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. I've talked already, so I'll try and keep it short. But I met a Polish neighbor recently here in London, and she was a lady who'd been in this country for 15 years, worked here with her kids, and she was generally afraid of going on a bus in London, not speaking Polish, but speaking English with a Polish accent, because she'd been abused verbally. And of course, this is a post-Brexit phenomena, which, as the very valuable paper points out, has resulted in 41% increase in hate crimes in the UK in the month following Brexit. I'm sure that's continued since then. And what worries me really is the linkage between far-right ideas creeping into the political mainstream, and one's seen the acceptance of xenophobia, hate crimes, attacks on foreigners, anti-Europeanism, which of course isn't limited to the UK. One's seen it in some of the Le Pen campaign and so forth. The question or the issue I wanted to raise, and I'd be very interested to find out experiences of Germany, Hungary, and other countries, Poland, is I know in the UK, and I believe somebody here from the London Mayor's office is here, local government has been quite active in combating violent extremism and far-right tendencies. And I feel that as well as civil society, it's very important that democratic local government has a role to play at the community level in counteracting these kind of things. Has that been the experiences in Germany? I know that the mayors have been very active in dealing with the refugees and so on and making provisions. But is that the case in other countries that progressive politicians at the local level can work with civil society to counteract some of these extremist tendencies?
Very, very good question. Like
a very quick response, because it's not just civil society. At the request of the Foreign Office, a colleague who's sitting over in the corner there and I have been doing hate crime training for Polish community organisations in England, precisely because members of the Polish community were singled out around the Brexit vote. I mean, something like 70 or 80% of hate crimes against East Europeans at the time of the Brexit vote were against Poles, and the Polish community felt that really. And it wasn't just people who've been here 50 years, there's people who've been here 50 years since the end of the Second World War. That's one thing. Also, we're going to Poland and doing training. So I've got money from the Foreign Office to translate CST material into Polish, which is being used with the Polish police now as training aid. So it's a two-way process. So governments are also fixed on this. It doesn't get any publicity and probably doesn't warrant any publicity. But the fact is, there's a very real concern within, certainly the British government, about this and a wish to do something about it.
Heidi, with the sort of people that you work with and represent, what's been their personal experience? I mean, for many people, presumably in the American community, to see, you know, someone like Trump and white supremacists being so close to the height of power there. Is there a genuine fear? Do they feel safe in America?
I mean, it's like sheer horror, right? You know, hate crimes, as anybody sitting here with me can tell you, are different in a way than other crimes. If I get robbed on the street, it's a scary and horrible experience. But if I get robbed because I'm a Muslim or because I'm Jewish or something, you know, particular ethnicity or minority group, that whole community now is fearful that they'll be attacked. So what happened after the election was all the groups of people that Trump signaled out, immigrants, Latinos, Muslims, women, and so on. I could go down the list. Basically every minority population and religion was in the crosshairs in some way, became consumed with fear about rampant violence in their communities. You know, there are some neighborhoods, very wealthy neighborhoods in New York, where one of our board members lived, where they had never seen anti-Semitic, swastikas on synagogues, on buildings. They'd never experienced that, and there was a horrific rash of that in that community. And I heard some personal stories that really be afraid to take your kids to school, for example. Of course, we had these threats against Jewish community centers and bombings. That's an example of the fear that was stoked among various minority populations in the United States in the wake of the election. It was basically terrifying for them, and people were just getting beat up in the street for no reason. It was a really awful and serious situation.
And Thomas, from the German perspective, you obviously alluded to that there have been some localized efforts, I suppose, to help with managing the transition for the migrant and refugee population that's coming since 2015. How much do you see a local role in I suppose, social cohesion and community relations, and also just strengthening and protecting these new communities?
Well, it's absolutely crucial. I mean, unfortunately, we've also seen a very serious rise in violent attacks, especially on asylum seekers or people who are perceived to be, and firebombings of installations, buildings where asylum seekers are at. And the real big problem for the local police is that in the past you could almost, very quickly you would narrow down who could it have been if you have a firebombing. I mean, very few people would do this. So you would look at your local neo-Nazis or your local skinheads and you say, well, probably it's one of those guys. Yeah? But so the recent trend is that we had people prosecuted who have had no history of any kind of involvement in the extreme right, who have, who have no criminal record and nothing. You know, we had a guy, a fireman, we had a guy who works for the local IRS because he was afraid the real estate prices are going to go down because the refugees are all moving in. All these kind of things that we have not seen before. So this is a very new challenge, and I think obviously this can only be resolved on the local level because this is where it all happens. Yeah? So fortunately, I think after, in the fall of 2015 when it all started and people just walked over from Austria. First of all, in hindsight, I think it is our luck that they moved in from the south, because we can say about Bavaria whatever we want, but they handled it as best as possible. No other state in Germany could have handled it that way. I'm convinced of that. If they would have arrived from the east, oh my God, we would have seen dead people. I'm 100% convinced. So that's lucky for us because the kind of organization in Bavaria and the southern states is so much better. It's more wealthy states too, but so this helped actually that it was somewhat okay. Still a lot of problems. Of course, if you have Syrians, you have anti-Semitism. It's just one of the many problems. This is the state ideology on Syria. Yeah, this is how they grew up with. The language is very difficult. For somebody to learn German, I would want to learn German. It's very difficult. So all these things, that we are still facing in the future. Nobody has a plan for this. Nobody could have. So if it is not solved in the communities, it will not be solved. It has to happen where they live.
Thank you very much. Okay. Very, very quickly.
I'm very keen to add something to this, since you mentioned the Polish community, and it's actually one of the points I omitted from my earlier talk. When I was a student here in the 90s, I was one of very few Polish people in the UK, and of course today it is close to 1 million people. That's a very big group, and Polish is the second most popular language spoken in the UK. And of course, the Polish people have suffered an increasing hate crime, and they have been subject to discrimination in many ways. And I think that also sometimes makes them prone to Polish far-right nationalist propaganda that comes here. But one last point I want to mention, since it is almost 1 million people, many of them are here for longer than 5 years by now. So they could have the right to vote in the Brexit referendum, for example. And very, very few of them did vote. I'm not saying the Polish vote would have changed the outcome, but who knows? But I think there is something missing in terms of the pattern of political socialization, if you like, of the Polish migrants into British life. And the Brexit referendum is one good example.
Thank you very much. Okay. Any final questions? We had a flurry of hands before.
Thank you, Jill, for the presentation. One thing that we've heard a lot of is the involvement of civil society and government responses. But I'm going to probe a little further. Who are the influencers in each respective country? Where should we be targeting efforts? Let's say further down on the spectrum where people are just beginning to engage with these ideas. At which stage can we make a difference, and who is best placed to make that difference? It's great talking about civil society in a very abstract term amongst this audience. What does that actually look like in reality? I work a lot with Islamist extremism, and we come across working with particular community leaders. We should work with imams. There was a rather big summit this weekend in Riyadh where Muslim leaders were gathered and talking about how to combat Islamist ideology. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on who the key influences are and how we can make a difference.
Well, wonderful final question. And what we'll do is go across the panel. This is an opportunity for some final thoughts. So to try and end on a slightly forward-thinking, at least if we can't be positive, note, what is the way forward here? Who should we be focusing our attentions on? Who, as this gentleman says, who are the influences? What is our best chance of turning the tides of history back the right way? Heidi.
Well, I think if I had to pick one thing, because I can think of quite a few strategies, including some that are undertaken by folks in this room who directly address people who are radicalizing. Well, I think at some point the fundamental issue of the internet matters here. I'll just say very quickly, more and more terrorists who commit acts, violent acts in the United States, which tend to be white supremacists, are learning everything they need to know about hating black people from the web. And so when there are things like the way Google's algorithm works to feed you more and more negative information, the lack of counter narratives, this space of how I begin to figure out who I hate has a lot more to do with the web now than anything else. And so I would point to strategies to tackle that. And look, you could talk about this, you could have a 5-day seminar about that issue, but that's the place where I would put a considerable amount of effort.
I certainly agree with Heidi. The internet is a prime arena to focus on, but no kid is born hating. It's something they absorb from their environment, from their parents. So for me, the most important area is young people. And to build it into school curricula at an early an age as possible, and particularly to encourage dialogue, interaction across the religious groupings between Jews and Muslims, between Muslims and Sikhs, between Hindus and Jews, whatever. But to work on young people as best as possible and as far as possible. I mean, bearing in mind all the issues that one has to take into account when you're dealing with the education of young people, but nevertheless, I would focus on education.
Well, the Never Again Association has existed since 1996, and over those years we have tested a number of strategies, but I think the best one is work in the field of popular culture, so sports and music, informal education, and with all due respect to school curriculum, I think, from my personal experience, I think the best things in life I learned outside of school, and I think that might be a way forward.
Yeah, of course, all of the above. I have to come back to what I said earlier. We have to put life back into democracy. I think for most people this is just an institutionalized routine. But I mean, if I ask my students, did you experience any kind of democratic experience in school? No, nothing. They're in school for 12 years and they find it undemocratic. There's no democratic practice there whatsoever, which doesn't mean that they should elect their teachers. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. But I mean, even there, we all think, they should all opt for democracy. Just you can also very much consciously opt against it. You can also opt against being free, which I mean, especially the Islamists, you can see that young women going to Syria, going to join Islamic State. How is that even possible? They come from these free societies where especially women have the greatest freedom the world has ever seen, and then they opt for not being free. That's incredible.
That's a matter of perception, isn't it? If you're a victim of Islamophobia, heightened tensions against your faith, against your identity, which you find is a key part of who you are.
And then you go to Syria and you are completely...
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I'm just saying, I think that idea of freedom, particularly for those kind of...
But anyway, my point is you can very much consciously opt not to be free and be maybe happier for it. I don't know. So we have to always keep that in mind. It's not a given. It's not like gravity, like a rule, you know, a natural law that it is always going to stay this way. We have to work for it every generation. And I see really democracy in practice to be empty, because I mean the people here on this table, we probably all have an excellent life, we have a nice income, we are happy, we are educated, and you know, it's not going to concern us. We're going to go our merry ways and have a nice life. It's not about us, you know, but we have to realize that for most people it seems to be a completely empty thing. Democracy, what does it mean for me? Yeah, so I think we have to find an answer to that. That's the most pressing question, all of us.
Yeah, there's a polarization theory by a Dutch academic who says that actually kind of the middle should be targeted, which hasn't been polarized yet. So it's he says that it's the focus shouldn't be on the fringes, like either left or right or whatever scale, but that initiatives should target those people who are in the middle, who are probably silent, who probably don't care about the issue yet, but there is a threat, but those who are vulnerable to be grabbed by extremists, by radical ideologies, and he says they should be actually targeted by positive and inclusive messages, so to create a feeling of togetherness. Emphasize commonalities. I think that could work in the long run.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for an absolutely fascinating discussion and for brilliant presentations from the panel. That brings us to a close. I'd like to thank our partners, FES, of course. I'd like to thank a wonderful, highly knowledgeable and enthusiastic audience. And of course our brilliant panelists for their candid, honest and extremely well-formed thoughts. So if we can all put our hands together for our panelists.